Mr. President, I want to, like all my colleagues here, express our sympathy and support and prayers for our colleague, Senator Kirk. Senator Kirk is someone who is new to the Senate, but served for a good number of years in the House of Representatives, but already has made a tremendous impact in coming to the Senate. Incredibly smart, hardworking, thoughtful, knowledgeable on so many different subjects. And so obviously we will miss his presence here in the near term, but hope and pray for a full, quick, complete recovery and hope to have him back with us soon. And so I know I speak on, I've heard many of my colleagues come down here, but certainly want to express my and my family's prayers and support for Senator Kirk and for his family as he tries to get back on his feet, and we wish him all the best as he does that, and hope that he will return soon and be able to get involved in many of the issues that he was involved with and has been involved with since he's come to the Senate. And if he were here, I think he would be very involved in the debates about that we're going to be having in the coming days about the budget. I think that today marks the 1,000th day since we've actually acted on a budget in the United States Senate. That's something that many people here who are interested in fiscal policy are very, very concerned about. Senator Kirk was one of those. I consider myself to be one of those. We have a lot of people here in the United States Senate who are very concerned about where we are as a nation, about the amount of spending, the amount of debt that we've racked up, continue to pile up on an annual basis. And it all starts, I think, Mr. President, with a budget. We spend $3.6 trillion of the American people's money on an annual basis, and yet we have not had a budget here in the United States Senate for 1,000 days. Literally now for 3 years, essentially, since the Senate last passed a budget. We cannot continue with a straight face to go to the American people and say that we are being good stewards of their tax dollars when in fact we don't even go through the exercise annually of determining and prioritizing how we're going to spend their hard-earned tax dollars. This is something that cries out for reform. My colleague, Senator Isaacson, who just spoke, has some proposals for budget reform that I think we ought to take up, we ought to vote on here in the United States Senate. I've got some ideas about budget reform. There are so many things that we need to do to change the budget process here in the Congress because we have failed to pass a budget resolution, not just for the past 1,000 days, but also for 5 of the last 7 election years. And we've only completed all the annual appropriation bills on time in 4 of the last 34 years. So we clearly have a problem. I don't think there's anybody here who can't say that this system is broken and needs to be fixed. And, you know, it strikes me at least that as we went through the 2012 budget process, we failed again to complete the appropriations work on time, and so we had to go through this annual exercise of doing a nearly $1 trillion omnibus spending bill at the 11th hour, yet again. And during the past 3 years, we've consistently had record deficits of $1.3 trillion or more. Clearly, what we have in place is not working, and the American people are the ones who are paying the price for that because the debt per person is now over $48,700. That's an increase of nearly $14,000 per, on an individual basis since President Obama took office. And if you think about it on a per household basis, it represents $126,000 per American family, per household, that is their share of our federal debt. That's a massive amount of money that we pile on to people in this country. And if you add in the unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare, which exceed $40 trillion, then you start talking about over $500,000 in liability for every family in this country. National debt's now more than $15 trillion, which is literally over 100% of our gross domestic product. To put that into perspective, 1 year ago, Greece was at 143%. We are not far behind. We are now 1-to-1, 100% debt to GDP. We're seeing the effect of high levels of sovereign debt on the economies of European countries like Greece, and if we fail to get spending here in our country on a sustainable path, we're going to face a similar crisis in the not-too-distant future. If we continue to see an economy that's struggling and growing at a very slow rate, we cannot grow that economy by making the federal government larger. If that's the case, the $1 trillion stimulus bill that passed in 2009 would have brought unemployment down. But as we know, the unemployment rate in this country is still at 8.5%. So we've got to unleash the economy, Mr. President. We need to cut spending in Washington, D.C. We've got to make the federal government smaller, not larger, and get federal spending as a percentage of our gross domestic product, as a percentage of our entire economy, back to more of a historical average. Today, the spending as a percentage of our GDP is about 25%. If you go in the last 40 years of American history, the average has been 20 to 21%. And ironically, there have only been 5 times since 1969 where the budget has actually been balanced. And in those cases where the budget was balanced, spending as a percentage of GDP was 18.7% on average. So it can be done, but we've got to get spending back to a more historic and reasonable level relative to our entire economy. The debt to GDP, as I mentioned earlier, is also historic because we haven't seen debt to GDP levels like this literally since the end of World War II. You have to go back over half a century to find a time when we were carrying debt to GDP that literally was 1-to-1, where the amount of debt that we have in this country is 100% of our entire economic output in a given year. That is a staggering, staggering number, and one that should make us all very concerned about our future if we don't take steps to correct it. And I think that point was driven home by the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, who has said in testifying before congressional committees that the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. Now think about that. He didn't say the Iranian nuclear program, he didn't say China, he didn't say North Korea, he didn't say Al-Qaeda. He said the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. That coming from the person who used to be the highest-ranking military official in this country. I think that speaks volumes about what we need to be focused on and why it is so important that we start getting our fiscal house in order. And why it is so important, frankly, Mr. President, that we pass a budget. 1,000 days without a budget. 1,000 days. And we spend $3.6 trillion every single year of the American people's money. Now, I think that, again, in order to get our fiscal house in order to get our economy back on track, we've got to cut spending. We have to reduce the amount that we spend. And that means we've got to take on some of the big challenges before us, like entitlement reform. We all know that about 3/5 of all federal spending is in what we call mandatory spending, and that represents programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid that aren't annually appropriated for by Congress, but are a function of the law. If you're eligible for a particular program, you're going to get a benefit under that program. That type of spending in our budget represents about 3/5 of all federal spending. If you add in interest on the debt, which is also mandatory spending, you get up to about 65 cents out of every dollar being spent right now is in mandatory spending. And when you've got programs like Medicaid, which is growing at about 3 times the rate of inflation, and Medicare, which is growing at 2 times the rate of inflation, it's pretty clear that that's not sustainable over time. We have to figure out a way to get these programs to where they aren't growing at 12% a year or 8% a year, closer to the rate of inflation. And that means that we've got to reform these programs if they're going to be sustainable and if they're going to be there for future generations of Americans. And that can be done without impacting the benefits that people who are on those programs today receive and those who are nearing retirement age. There's a real concern. There's a lot of political rhetoric, hot political rhetoric about Republicans just want to cut benefits for seniors across this country. I think, as most of my colleagues know, there have been several proposals put forward that would address the long-term challenges that we face with regard to Medicare, Medicaid, and for that matter, Social Security, all of which would not impact people who are retired today, nor those who are nearing retirement age, but simply put in place some reforms that would impact younger Americans who today are working hard and putting money into these programs, but if we don't take steps to fix these programs, they're not going to be around when those people retire. So entitlement reform is so important in terms of getting federal spending under control. And that's why, notwithstanding the fact that it is an election year, I hope there will be the political will here in the Congress and with the President, and frankly, Mr. President, it's going to take presidential leadership to do these types of things. You cannot do big things. You cannot conquer big challenges and big problems in this country absent presidential leadership. There are 535 members of Congress. There is only one president. There's only one person who can sign a bill into law. There's only one person who can engage the Congress and work toward a solution to some of these big challenges. And this president so far has demonstrated no willingness to take on the challenges that we face with regard to our budget. It was demonstrated last year when he submitted his budget to Congress. It was ultimately voted on here in the Senate, and it was voted down by a vote of 97-0. I think that tells you that they have not been serious about taking on the major drivers of federal spending in this country. Now, with regard to the other part of our budget, the discretionary part, we saw spending increase in that part of our budget by about 24% between 2008 and 2010. Literally grew at about 8 to 10 times the rate of inflation. And so we need to get that side of our spending under control as well. Many of us have supported legislative efforts that would roll back discretionary spending to 2008 levels to get us back in a place where we can defend the things that we are doing here to the American people at a time when they are seeing their family budgets shrink, they're seeing their personal assets shrink, and many of them are having a very hard time finding work. And so cutting spending, reducing spending, reforming entitlement programs, getting our fiscal house in order, Mr. President, is just essential, absolutely essential, if we want to put our country on a path and a track that will prevent us from heading for the train wreck that many of our allies, many of the countries in Europe are facing right now, simply because they made promises to their people that they just couldn't keep. And we've got to get our spending under control in this country and rein it in, or that is our future. And I hope for the sake of our children and grandchildren here in this country that we're willing to make the hard political decisions that will enable that to happen. The second thing we've got to see, Mr. President, if we're going to get out of this sort of morass that we're in right now, in addition to reducing spending, is we have got to get the economy growing again. We have to expand this economy, grow this economy. It's been said that the rising tide lifts all the boats. Well, we need to get a tide that starts lifting all Americans. Instead of talking about how we are going to redistribute the pie, we need to make the pie bigger. And the way you do that is you grow and expand the economy. If we start growing and expanding the economy, we'll get more Americans back working again. We'll have more people making money, more people investing. And when more people are making money, it means they're paying more taxes and revenues go up. And that makes a lot of these other issues much more manageable. But you've got to have economic growth, and you have to have policies in place, Mr. President, that promote economic growth. And regrettably, the policies of the current administration have had the opposite effect. They have made it more difficult, more expensive to create jobs in this country. We need to put policies in place that will make it less expensive, less difficult to create jobs, and that will encourage people and provide the kind of economic certainty that gets people to invest their money, to put their capital to work, and to get Americans back to work in this country. And I think there are several things, obviously, that need to be done. One, of course, is to reform the tax code, which, in my view, right now is a roadblock, if you will, an obstacle, an impediment to economic growth. We are not competitive in the world marketplace because of our tax policies. What we need today is a clear, fair, simple tax code that does away with a lot of the special interest loopholes that exist today, that broadens the tax base in this country, but at the same time that lowers rates so that businesses want to invest here in America as opposed to moving their headquarters and taking their jobs overseas. We want to encourage investment here. That means we have got to reform our tax code. And that means, Mr. President, as I said, that we've got to do away with a lot of the tax code today that is riddled with loopholes. We've got to do away with those loopholes. We need to get our tax rates down to where they're competitive with the countries around the world that are stealing business from us all the time and taking jobs overseas. So tax reform is an essential, in my view, element of an economic growth strategy that will get us on a path where the economy is growing and expanding and where we're creating jobs in this country. That's going to take presidential leadership, just as entitlement reform is going to take presidential leadership. You can't do big things in this country absent presidential leadership. And this is another area where we've not seen that from this president. And I would hope that he will engage the Congress, again, notwithstanding the fact that this is an election year, in a debate, and perhaps more than a debate, but a solution to the tax code in this country that will get us on a competitive footing and make us more competitive in the world marketplace. And the president is going to have to do that, be involved in that debate, or it's not going to happen, particularly in a political year. The other thing we've got to do, Mr. President, is we've got to get our arms around these runaway, overreaching, excessive regulations that are strangling small businesses in this country. I cannot tell you how many times when I travel my state of South Dakota, or any place else for that matter, that I don't hear from small businesses that the number one obstacle right now to us creating jobs is this massive amount of regulation coming out of Washington, D.C. And in fact, there have literally been thousands and thousands and thousands of new pages of regulations that have been promulgated and have been issued since this president took office. And they affect every sector of our economy. Now, the one that we hear about the most probably is the EPA, but you've got the Department of Labor. You've got other agencies of government that constantly are putting forward new regulations which make it more difficult, more complicated to get people in this country back to work. And just as a point, a fact about that, a recent set of regulations proposed by the Department of Labor, which, by the way, there was no complaint about this, there was no consultation with the people that would be impacted by this. There wasn't any really reason that we can come up with for why these regulations were put forward. But the Department of Labor, in their infinite wisdom, has decided that they know better about how to run a farming operation, a ranching operation in this country than the people who are involved in those endeavors, and have basically put forward some regulations that would make it put all kinds of new restrictions on young people working in family farming or ranching operations. Incredibly prescriptive regulations, I might add, detailed regulations that are going to change the culture and the economic fabric of ranching and farming in this country like anything we've seen before. Anybody who's been around a farming operation enterprise in my part of the country realizes they are inherently family operations. The young people are involved in those operations. And when the Department of Labor comes out and says that young people can't operate certain types of equipment, or young people can't work with farm animals that are older than 6 months, or can't be in an elevation that's any more than 6 feet, it is a complete contradiction to the way that work gets done in rural parts of this country. But that's what we have. We've got a massive amount of new regulation coming out of the Department of Labor that will forever change the way that farming operations are carried out, and the work gets done on a family farm. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, Mr. President. It is overreaching, it is excessive, it goes beyond the pale in terms of what we need by way of regulation in this country. We need smart regulation. There are public health and safety reasons why we need it, but this kind of overreaching, excessive regulation is just making it that much more difficult for people to get jobs in this country. And the final thing I'll mention with regard to an economic agenda that I think will get people back to work and to create jobs, Mr. President, is the issue of energy security. We need an energy policy in this country that promotes domestic production, that recognizes that we have enormous amounts of resources here at home, that we shouldn't have to continue to import a lot of our energy from outside the United States. The Keystone Pipeline, which was just recently vetoed by the administration, turned down, is an example of that. It was studied for 3 years extensively by the many agencies of the government, the EPA. There were a series of environmental impact statements done, all cleared, all teed this thing up to be done. And just this last week, the President said, no, it's not in the national interest. Well, I would argue, and I think a lot of people on both sides here in the Senate would argue that this is in the national interest, that it's a lot better for us to get 700,000 barrels of oil a day from a friendly neighbor like Canada as opposed to a country like Venezuela. We can continue to buy oil from Hugo Chavez, or we can get that same equivalent amount of oil from a friendly neighbor like Canada, bring it into this country where it's refined here, creates jobs, puts people back to work, puts capital to work in this country, gets investment here in the United States. Instead, we're going to see that energy source go the other direction. It's going to go to Asia, it's going to go to China. if we aren't able to get projects like this approved. Now, interestingly enough, there was a pipeline just like this that was built a few years ago, and it goes right through the eastern part of my state and other states, and this pipeline would go through the western part of my state of South Dakota, as well as other states, but it would bring much of that energy resource into this country, create jobs, and help create economic growth here in America, as opposed to sending that energy over the seas and making us even more dependent upon foreign sources of energy here at home. It just makes absolutely no sense, Mr. President. If the President of the United States is serious in his rhetoric about focusing every morning on creating jobs, you'd think the first thing that he would want to do is support projects that create shovel-ready jobs, in this case 20,000 shovel-ready jobs, an investment of $7 billion, and bring energy into this country that will make us more energy independent. That is absolutely right in the wheelhouse of what we ought to be looking for in terms of getting this country's economy back on track, and yet the President last week turned thumbs down on this proposal. So I simply would say again in closing, Mr. President, that in my view, if we're going to get our country back on track, we have got to get our fiscal house in order, which means we have got to reduce spending, get our spending as a percentage of our entire economy back into a form, more of a historical norm. As I said, for the past 40 years, that's been about 20 to 21% of our economy. Today, we're spending 25%, and we're on a trajectory that not too far from now, we'll be spending about 40% of our entire economy on the federal government, not to mention the amount that we spend on state and local governments. We've got to get spending under control, and then we have got to get policies in place that will promote long-term economic growth and reverse the decline that we've seen, the massive amount of debt that we've racked up over the past 3 years, and the huge job losses that we've seen at the same time. And if we can do that, we will at least be doing the people's work in terms of trying to address the major problems that I think face most Americans and the things that they're most concerned about every single day. Mr. President, I yield the floor.